Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Mapungubwe Annual Lecture 2017. Thank you very much for braving the chilly Johannesburg weather. You've been very brave, and hopefully we will have a very heated and interesting and insightful discussion tonight that's going to warm you up. So a very warm welcome. My name is Phoebe Potgieter-Gubule, and I'm a board member of the Mapungubwe Institute, minus the doctor. I'm still studying towards this very important position. So this is very aspirational. I don't know, MISTRA was encouraging me, but it doesn't belong there yet. So the Mapungubwe Institute does these annual lectures as part of a lot of other things, and the executive director will talk about what MISTRA does. But it has the annual lecture as a way of taking forward the public debate, the strategic reflection that we see as part of our role as a think tank. In addition to that, as you may have seen outside, there are a range of publications which are the product of the research work that MISTRA does. So you are encouraged to buy the books and read them and share them with your friends, and encourage your friends to also read them and buy them. Our annual lecture tonight will focus on the theme Radical Economic Transformation: Are Fiscal and Monetary Authorities a Help or a Hindrance? Now, South Africa, 23 years after democracy, are struggling with a whole range of different issues with regards to whether we have managed to move as fast as we could with economic transformation. And if one listened to the report of the Department of Labor about representation, whether it's women or black people in management, and professions, then it looks like we haven't done a lot of progress or as fast as we could. On a whole range of other levels, whether it's from land, agriculture, whether it is industrial development, whether it is ownership, as well as issues of industrial development, the jury is still out about whether we have achieved and lived up to our potential and the expectations set by the Reconstruction and Development Program in 1994 and encapsulated in the Constitution of the Republic. So our speakers tonight and our keynote speaker will focus on one aspect of this broader issues that South Africa face, the issue of economic transformation and whether fiscal and monetary authorities will help, is a help or a hindrance. I will introduce him later. But let me once again warmly welcome you and also say thank you very much to the University of Johannesburg for hosting us, for the leadership of the university for having us here tonight. A special welcome to the board of MISTRA, as well as members of the council. And once again, thank you very much to our speaker who has agreed to share his thoughts on these matters tonight. I'm now going to hand over to the Executive Director or to the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research and Internationalism of University of Johannesburg, Professor Chiliti Marwala, who will then welcome you on behalf of the university. And thank you once again, Prof, for having us here.
Thank you very much, Phoebe, for the introduction. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the presence of the MISTRA board for bringing this lecture to the University of Johannesburg. You have done a good job by bringing it to the University of Johannesburg. It is indeed the largest university in Johannesburg with 50,000 students. I also would like to acknowledge our speaker, Mr. Jonas, for coming to share your experience with us tonight on a very important topic, radical economic transformation. You see, I am a mechanical engineer. when you are talking about transformation, I'm thinking about a rotating wheel. So how it links to economics and radicalism, will be eagerly waiting to hear from you. Maybe just to introduce University of Johannesburg for those of you who do not know what it is all about. The University of Johannesburg has 50,000 students and there's 4 campuses. This is one of the 4 campuses of the University of Johannesburg. And we actually take pride in our Pan-African identity. And because of that, we believe it is important for the University of Johannesburg to become part of the solution to the problems that are confronting the African continent. The problems of poverty, the problems of technological underdevelopment, the problems of inequality, ethnic and social cohesion, issues that still needs to be addressed. So this really, talks like this actually goes a long way towards contributing to that, to make sure that we have a society where everybody feels that they have a stake in it. Conversation is very important at the University of Johannesburg. I personally believe that it is important for us to speak and to converse. But most importantly, it is important for us to write, Mr. Jonas. So whatever you're going to speak tonight, ultimately it should find itself to some form of writing. I think that is very, very important. I know in our African tradition, we take pride of the concept of oral history. I think oral history is inaccurate. If you tell a story to 3 different people, you have 3 different stories. So if you really want yourself not to be misquoted, Mr. Jonas, you have to write things down. Then you can refer back to what you have actually written. With those few words, I am glad to say that feel at home at the University of Johannesburg. Unfortunately, this is in the evening. Otherwise, I would be encouraging you to see our beautiful campus and to explore it. But we are going to have time to interact later, and I hope you are going to get the opportunity to interact with our students, very, very bright students, and they will be able to learn from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof, and thank you for that warm welcome and your point about the need for conversation and a space for conversation. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for the 2017 Mapungubwe Annual Lecture, Mr. Mcebisi Jonas, who is the former Deputy Minister of Finance, who has a very long history in the struggle against apartheid. And the two of us actually know each other from the 1980s, mid-1980s, when we served together on the national executive of something called AZASO, the Azanian Students Organization, although it was an student organization that were organizing at the time. He played a key role in the establishment of UDF, United Democratic Front structures in the Eastern Cape, where he's originally from, escaping the hit squads many times. He was later sent into exile to complete military training in Angola and Uganda as a member of Umkhonto we Sizwe, and during that period in exile, he also was employed by the United Nations to run an education program for MK cadres. After 1994, Mr. Mcebisi Jonas, or Comrade Mcebisi Jonas, was a member of the Eastern Cape Provincial Executive Committee of the ANC from 1997 till 2004, and then from 2007 until 2009. He has obtained his Bachelor's of Arts in History and Sociology at Vista University, a higher diploma in education at Rhodes University, and also a range of other programs that he's read for, including marketing at the University of Cape Town, investment and trade promotion, at the Island Development Agency, Investment and Trade Promotion in Singapore, as well as Management, Investment and Trade Programs at the Malaysian Development Agencies. One of the things that he makes him very apt to be delivering this lecture on radical economic transformation and the role of fiscal and monetary authorities has been his role in the executive, where he has served in the Eastern Cape as worked in the establishment of both the Kuga as well as the East London Industrial Development Zones. He was a member of the EXCO responsible for economic development, environmental, mental affairs and tourism between 2009 and 2014, and then again as a member of the Executive Council or MEC for Finance in the Eastern Cape from 2009 until 2010. And then as chairperson of the Portfolio Committee of Human Settlements for the Eastern Cape Legislature from 2007 until 2009, and Chief Executive Officer of the Eastern Cape Development Corporation, which was tasked with the amalgamation of the then Transkei Development Corporation, Ciskei Development Corporation, the Ciskei People's Bank, and the other smaller developmental institutions. And then most recently served as Deputy Minister of Finance. His experience in this range of positions in government and in the public sector means that he's assured us a very interesting take on the development of institutions. And as we hand over to him to look at the question about the role of fiscal and monetary authorities, whether they are a help or a hindrance, I think that his experience in this range of different institutions will help him to answer this question. And may I repeat what Prof has said, that at the end of the day you have to write it down. We need to move beyond oral history. Thank you very much, and I welcome to the stage.
Can I just acknowledge everybody who's here today? Can I say all protocol observed? The leadership of the university, the board of Mapungubwe, and its executives, and everybody who's here today, let me acknowledge you. I sometimes think that when I say all protocol observed, I mean it is observed really. Prof, the paper is written, so it will be circulated, just to meet that. I'll leave that to Mapungubwe. In March, Joel sent me a letter inviting me to give this 5th Mapungubwe Annual Lecture. I was honored until I saw the topic. And although I accepted it up front, when I saw the topic, I was a bit daunted. But then after some time, I realized that let me not negotiate a change. After trying, I could see that I'm not going to succeed with Joel. So I stuck to the topic as it is. I think it is an excellent question and of central relevance because it goes to the heart of the present economic governance issues. What could be more relevant than to ask, how can the two of our core institutions, the one dealing with the flows of public money, the other dealing with the flows of private money, be better utilized to effect fundamental economic transformation? My main argument today, just to summarize it up front, is that there is scope for using our core economic institutions more boldly to drive fundamental economic change, especially through aligning fiscal and credit allocation to a more coherent strategy for inclusive growth. We must also, I think I will be arguing, avoid the obvious temptation of populism and recognize the various policy constraints within which we're making policy choices. We should also be alert to short-term political expediency because that could bring to our country long-term ruin. And I would finally argue that any economic transformation must be anchored in a much stronger democratic consensus, both amongst the people as well as amongst institutions. The structure of the paper is a very simple one. I will begin by just making few conceptual remarks on the state and the economy. Then I will review the fundamental features of our national economy. And the reason for that, of course, it will become apparent because part of my argument is that any radical economic transformation must be about progressively and sustainably changing those features, the features of our national economy. The third element of will be to try to respond more directly to the question, giving particular attention to understanding the scope for new policy emphasis in the light of various constraints faced by the two institutions. Finally, I will comment on the current politics of radical economic transformation and what must be done to restore integrity to meaningful policy dialogue on the economic trajectory of our country. Now, can I start off by just making the general point that there is a general consensus amongst all economic commentators and stakeholders that South African economy is in dire need for a major overhaul. South Africa remains locked in a low-growth, path-dependent economic trajectory that is currently deepening social inequality and a highly concentrated ownership patterns. So there can be no denial that the economy needs to be radically transformed. We might have to quibble about what that means. And that also requires us to think afresh on the roles of institutions in economic governance and resource allocations. Just to focus on institutions a little bit, over the last 20 years, institutions have moved to the center in debates concerning economic development. Poor quality institutions have come to be seen as the root cause of poor economic performance. One of the better known recent perspectives on this matter is contained in a popular book by Asameglu and Robinson called Why Nations Fail. The authors argued that failed nations have extractive institutions which serves the interests of narrow elites, while successful economies have inclusive institutions which allow innovation and growth to flourish. According to the authors, countries characterized by extractive institutions will not sustain innovation and growth, as many are currently experiencing, unless they transform to more inclusive institutions. Countries like, if you take South Korea, which commenced their economic upswing with extractive institutions, would not have been able to sustain levels of prosperity without transforming to more inclusive forms of economic governance. I mean, China would probably go through the same process of moving towards more inclusive economic governance. While I think most of us could agree that institutions are critical for prosperity, for economic prosperity, at the same time, I think we should be skeptical of grand theories and general perspectives on this subject. Sharma, in his book, The Rise and Fall of Nations, Forces of Change in the Post-Crisis World, makes the important point that institutions themselves reflect the economic structure of the country. Where wealth is created primarily through innovation and productivity gains, societies tend to have stronger and more enduring institutions. Where wealth is created primarily through rent-seeking, institutions are always vulnerable and under threat. This requires probably this actually presents what I will call a chicken and egg paradox. Inclusive institutions are required to restructure an economy towards more shared and sustained prosperity, but elite interests controlling rents actively prevent the necessary innovation and institutional change. Also very relevant to South Africa is a recent book by Francis Fukuyama called Political Order and Political Decay. Fukuyama argues that modern and successful polities have a balance of three sets of institutions: the state executive bureaucracy, the rule of law, and systems of democratic accountability. And he argues that all these institutions are subject to decay and corruption and require constant and vigilant renewal. In South Africa's case, while our legal and democratic systems still display signs of life and vitality, our state executive institutions show strong signs of weakness and corrupt capture. Indeed, we continually observe the integrity of state institutions being compromised for short-term political expediency. Moreover, it seems that some in influential positions, leadership positions, seem to accept that this should be the case, almost with complete disregard of the importance of strong institutions in driving economic development. So far, our key economic institutions of National Treasury and SAP, which are probably the subject of this discussion, have remained centers of excellence in a sea of institutional decay and mediocrity. But imagine the economic damage if this is to be the case. I will return to this point later in the lecture. The problem with grand theories and what I call overly ideological policy prescripts is that they do not do justice to the complexity of the relationship between institutions and economic development, which necessarily varies over time and particular circumstances. Similarly, as tempting as it may be, we cannot simply copy what has worked elsewhere in the world without fully appreciating the enabling conditions which allowed institutions and economies in particular contexts to flourish. If you take the case of Singapore, which is currently in our news, I know that it's in the news because of some premier visiting them. Singapore has a highly effective working model of state capitalism, which debunks the global standard view that fully privatized enterprises are more efficient than state-owned companies. Isabel Sim, in her analysis of Singapore's government-linked companies, GLCs, show how Singapore's GLCs perform better and more efficiently than private companies. She attributes this to 4 factors. The first is that the GLCs operate within a very strong corporate governance culture, which limits short-term political interference. Secondly, the GLCs operate within zero-tolerance corruption environment. Thirdly, the GLCs are meritocratic and characterized by high levels of technical capacity and professionalism. Fourthly, there is a primary focus on bottom-line performance and competitiveness. I'm sure we'll all agree that we have a very different context to what pertains here at home. Nationalization in a context of entrenched corruption, weak corporate governance, patronage rather than meritocratic appointment, and disdain from the bottom line, from the bottom line, if our existing companies are anything to go by, will not deliver improved outcomes with respect to employment, poverty reduction, and reduced inequality. There are countless examples from Latin America and Asia which outline the economic dangers and consequences of widespread nationalization without the requisite state capacity and integrity. Unfortunately, it is the poor who suffer most. Losses incurred by inefficient state companies always result in fewer resources available for the pro-poor, anti-inequality fiscal expenditure. It would be a major failure of our political system, and probably a tragic one, if South Africa continues to follow a self-destructive path to radical economic ruin. The so-called Venezuelan option would not amount to creative destruction, as some advocates would have us believe, but would perhaps be more similar to the 19th century Nongqawuse, or the Kati killing, which actually saw the mighty Xhosa nations being impoverished. Just to go back to the fundamental features of South Africa's economy, and probably some definition on radical economic transformation. 2 years ago, I wrote a piece on radical economic transformation. which began by discussing the multiple interpretation of the concept. I must also confess that since then, very little development at that level has come through. In this year's State of the Nation address, President Zuma defined radical economic transformation as follows, I quote, "Fundamental change in structure, systems, institutions, and patterns of ownership, management, and control of the economy in favor of all South Africans, especially the poor, the majority of whom are African and female." Whilst there's nothing wrong fundamentally with this definition, it is pitched as at too general and abstract a level to be useful to answer Joel's question. Here I wish to define RET, the radical economic transformation, as a progressive structural change in the fundamental features of South Africa's political economy. And that's probably my operational definition for the purpose of this discussion. And to make sense of this statement, we probably need to have a broad agreement on what are the fundamental features that need to be progressively and sustainably changed. So at the risk of boring repetition, let us identify the fundamental features. I'm hoping that by now, the following list of 8 features and the required changes to them could be regarded as uncontroversial, or should I say conventional wisdom, and broadly agreed by many analysts. Perhaps they might be quibbling on the terminology and phrasing of these issues. The first is that South Africa has a seriously underperforming mixed economy, or really existing capitalist democracy. Of course, property rights are protected by the Constitution, and the ruling party supports mixed economy of a social democratic variety, at least the mainstream. There could be variants within that. The second is, as a result of the colonial apartheid legacy, South Africa suffers extreme inequality, particularly along racial lines. The stats are quite well known, but remain staggering, and probably we should repeat them just for the sake of this discussion. South Africa is a rich country. In 2016, we had a GDP of about 4.4 trillion at current prices, and had 16.9 million households. So if you could do the sums, you would probably come to a conclusion that you could easily, if it was equally distributed, you would easily feed all the families. About 20% of the household earn less than 10% of the total amount, which is about 1,100 a month. And about 2/3 of all households earn less than half of this. Only 8% of Black African households have monthly expenditure of more than 10,000, while 63% of white households do. Also, the wealthiest 10% of the population own 90 to 95% of wealth. And that probably tells you the challenge that we have. And I think the argument is obviously all of this must change without jeopardizing increasing both private and public investment. The third feature is that South Africa is only partially industrialized, and we have exceptionally high unemployment rates and low labor market participation rates by international standards. Essentially, we have accumulated insufficient capital to employ all our people. Present rates of private investment are not much larger than depreciation. This again points to the need to increase rates of real investment in our country, both public and private. The fourth element is our private sector is dominated by large-scale capital and capital-intensive industries. This reflects a global trend and historical tendencies of capitalism towards concentration and centralization of capital. But by international standards, we have an unusually low contribution of SMMEs to economic activities and low new business startups rates and entrepreneurship rates, And that's probably one of the things that we need to seek to change. The fifth element is that the economy is completely integrated into the global economy, both through international trade, capital flows, and ownership. We remain dependent on mineral-based exports. We must grow out of our export industries more. As regard to foreign capital, it is noted that for the first time ever in 2015, South African foreign assets exceeded foreign liabilities. Our foreign liabilities are mainly portfolio investments and direct investment. Our foreign liabilities are equal to 72% of our fixed capital stock. These are all stubborn facts. The large amount of foreign capital invested in this country means that we must continue to guard against capital flight and disinvestment. We need to increase foreign direct investment and progressively reduce our dependence on foreign funding for our national fiscus. The sixth element is, in terms of the sector structures of our economy, it is now dominated by the services sector, which accounts for 69% of the GDP. In particular, the finance, insurance, real estate, and business sector has seen rapid growth over the last 20 years. We need to ensure that this sector becomes more responsive and relevant to increasing fixed investment in infrastructure, SMME, and I'll be talking about that later. The seventh point is that despite large fiscal allocation to education and training, outcomes remain very poor. A poorly educated and trained majority perpetuates inequality and is a binding constraint on all facets of social development. So there can be no radical economic transformation unless we fix our broken education and training system. The eighth point is our public sector is generally weak. We need to transform our public sector to make it more effective and more capable, less wasteful and less corrupt. In particular, we need political leadership that has the will and the wise courage and truly focused dedication to forcefully drive implementation of economic transformation. Another important part of it is low levels of accountability in the public sector. And that's something that we need to address as we move along. So with the frightening thing, of course, is that I'm sure in differing ways, if we talk about most of these features, and I'm sure if you go to all of these, both the fiscal and monetary authorities, and talk about these points, we'll all agree that probably more or less this is what we face as a problem. Of course, the question is, why are we not addressing it? Before moving to a more detailed response to the question, I want to make a few general points. The first is that these 8 fundamental issues I've raised are pretty much mutually reinforcing. We cannot address some whilst neglecting others. And it's probably even impossible that we can make progress on all 8 at the same time. So there's a need for thinking about more strategically about planning and coordination around these issues and prioritization. The second point I wanted to make is that the stubborn fact that there are constraints, there's another stubborn fact that there are constraints to policy. We may all want more fiscal redistribution, higher public spending, but the macroeconomic consequences will be seriously negative, as the history of economic populism in Latin America, for example, make it abundantly clear. In our case, capital mobility cannot be ignored. Given its large presence in our national economic life, more on all of this I'll be talking about. Thirdly, third general point I wanted to make is that we need to accept that both public sector and the private sector are rather weak and moribund. In particular, the public sector needs to create more supportive conditions for increased domestic fixed investment by private capital and by existing big business. The fourth general point I wanted to make is that one of the most contested area of economic policy in South Africa today is how to deal with established wealth and big business. We must accept the inevitable truth that we need big business and require its mobilization in support of industrial diversification to unlock the competitiveness of new industries where we have comparative advantage. The creation of this new wealth is critical to the successful deracialization of the economy. The large amounts of capital required for successful economic restructuring program do not magically appear from heaven. And we do not want more debt that exacerbate our fiscal risk. We need radically increased investment in fixed capital, and for this to happen, we need policy certainty and more competitive cost of doing business. These include security of supply and cost of energy, cost of trade and logistics, supply and cost of skills, etc. Some of our major corporates are now investing in countries like China, Brazil, and elsewhere in Africa. This requires urgent attention and a mindset shift in terms of the role we see for big capital in unlocking the necessary investment and growth and transformation. We also need a mindset change in how we go about deracializing ownership of the economy. We must accept that to date, we have had limited success, and we need new conversations with all economic role players about how we radically increase black share of assets and wealth. In doing this, we must be cognizant of the historical reality, which shows that crude and aggressive indigenization programs lead to capital flight, declining levels of investment, increased social tension, and most importantly, have zero impact on poverty and unemployment. We must also accept that indigenization programs often serve as little more than thinly veiled attempts of politically collected elites to capture rents, and what the SACP calls radical economic looting. So dealing with corruption and the integrity of the state becomes a prerequisite for effective black economic empowerment and racial transformation of the economy. Now I'll move to a more detailed analysis and understanding of the functioning of the two institutions. The fiscal and monetary authorities of any modern fixed economy are fundamental institutions of national governance, involving, as they do, creation of national money, the control of credit by banks, the raising of taxes, and control of government spending, and so on. It is therefore entirely appropriate that the two institutions get their own chapter in the 1996 Constitution, Chapter 13, titled Finance. And I'm not going to bore you by going through that. I'll suggest that you go through that. But in the detailed lecture, I capture what that section says. Since Mapungubwe Institute is a place of strategic reflection, I'm hoping that the following ruminations will not be out of place. And I must also say upfront that I'm not claiming to be a guru on finance in any way, in any serious way. The long paper, which is available, I think will be given to MISTRA, details the historical context of the functioning of monetary policy in South Africa and monetary authorities in South Africa. But it's also important that we take a backward look at where we come from. And I capture that in the long paper, which I'm not going to bore you by going through now. The SAB is one of the few central banks globally, other than Belgium, Greece, Italy, Turkey, and the US, that is not wholly government-owned. Hence the attention on nationalization. The SAB is owned by 650 private shareholders. That's just facts. The SAB has 2 million issued shares. Each shareholder has a maximum of 10,000 shares. The present share price is 3 Rand a share. The annual dividend a share is 10 cents. But clearly nobody would invest there. When SAB was established in 1921, most banks were privately owned, and that's why I think you see this trend. The sub-shareholders have no real power, and that's very important. The shareholders of the central bank have no real power. The only thing they do is to vote for 7 board members, and of course they are qualified what those board members are. The other 8 board members are appointed by the president of the country. That includes the governor and 3 deputy governors. So again, it shows that this argument about nationalization is not founded on facts. The governor meets periodically with members of parliament portfolio and select committee of finance. I can't help, therefore, but to think that this is probably a red herring in a sense. I think the image that is being presented of an institution that is controlled by outside forces rather than government of South Africa is incorrect. The implication is that SAB does not behave in the national interest. And let me be upfront again. SAB is accountable through the Minister of Finance to Parliament, and therefore to the people of South Africa. SAB has an immutable constitutional mandate and is governed in terms of the 1989 Reserve Bank Act and, of course, the Banks Act. Whilst it is to be expected that in a democratic system there will always be contestation, but probably one of the messages I want to put across is that we actually must ensure that this institution is politically protected and empowered so that it could play its constitutional mandate, because the opposite will be a disaster for the country. I'll come back to the point again in conclusion. The South African monetary authorities perform a number of important functions in managing national money, banks, and broad financial sector. These functions need to be preserved and reproduced, and may be regarded, if you come back to the question, critical for the RET-type processes. They may therefore be regarded, if I come back to Joel's question, be seen to be helping the radical economic transformation. And let me start with the helpful functions. I'll just flip through them, but I think you will get a lot of detail in the paper. The first is protecting the value of the rand. I could go on and explain why. I'm sure many people would understand. Preserving an efficient national payment system by SAB together with banks. The third is bank credit creation, which is very crucial for accelerating capital accumulation and systems, and must be preserved to support increased private investment. The fourth is financial sector stability. And I'm sure we would all agree that South Africa has always been praised. Our banking system has always been praised, partly because the strength and quality of our oversight and supervision, but also partly because of its stability, generally speaking. The fifth is foreign exchange regulation regarding pension funds and other institutional investors are at 75% of their assets must be invested in domestic market. This is very useful because it creates basis for investment in all sectors. The last point is our country's foreign exchange reserves, which have tripled over the last few years to about 700 billion rands. So, and again, I would argue that these assets must be protected. Before looking at the various possible hindrances of our monetary authorities to RET and what to do about them, I want to take a closer look at the crucial issue of bank credit creation. Now, capital, in the sense of money used to make money, is greatly assisted in its accumulation by, amongst other things, credit. The role of bank credit in accelerating capital accumulation is a recurring theme in all 3 volumes of Marx Capital, and was later also emphasized by both Schumpeter and Keynes later. Joseph Schumpeter argues that, and I quote from him, that someone can only become an entrepreneur by previously becoming a debtor. What the entrepreneur first wants is credit. Before he requires any goods, whatever, he requires purchasing power. He is the typical debtor in capitalist society, unquote. In this process, the banker is the key agent. The banker, therefore, is not so much a middleman in the commodity purchasing power as a producer of this commodity. He is the overseer of exchange economy. So I'm probably trying to emphasize the importance of banks and the importance of credit in capital accumulation, broadly speaking. In other words, banks are arbiters of the expansion of the entrepreneurial social stratum, including startups and SMME expansion. The development of a banking system whose assets, credit extensions, are counted as part of effective supply of money is an important ingredient in promotion of investment. This is reflected in Keynes' view that bank credit, I quote again, is the pavement along which production travels. And the bankers, if they knew their duty, would provide the transport facilities to just the extent that is required in order that the productive powers of communities can be employed at their full capacity, unquote. So both Schumpeter and Keynes were aware that bank credit is created out of nothing, subject, of course, to capital adequacy and liquidity of requirements of central banks. The recent history of quantitative easing by world's major central banks has revealed clearly to everyone who cared to look that central banks can create trillions of dollars, pounds, euros, yens at a click of a mouse. The US Fed and Bank of England have only recently publicly admitted this. Now, if you look at credit extension in South Africa, which is the point I was trying to come to with this introduction, total credit extension in South Africa is about 3 trillion, of which 60% is to the household sector, mainly for mortgage loans. 40% is corporate investment, and a very tiny proportion of credit extension goes to small business and new startups. So effectively, high-earning households and corporates are the main recipients of bank credit. So the credit creation activities of banks help, therefore, to keep the economic status quo functioning, which is very important, by the way. But seems far from the progressive role banks should play, as observed and written about by some of the quotes that I've just given you. There is interesting literature on how the financial sector, private banks, and development finance institutions can be better engineered to support investment in infrastructure, agriculture, small business development, etc. And I found particularly, I would really recommend that people read Professor Epstein and Julian on the subject, because it's very modern and working within the World Bank framework. Of course, there are possible problems which you could pick up with this argument. If you are to prioritize credit and redirect it to particular recipients. And some of it include the following. A large increase in total credit creation could increase imports and induce capital flight, causing rent depreciation and all other problems associated with it. The second is obviously a diversion of credit to priority industries and recipients could increase risk exposure of banks and possibly reduce their profitability. And sub-credit creation in favor of DFI and compensated by regulated and equivalent reduction in present bank credit creation, whilst less riskier, is even riskier in the current environment that we have of state capture and rampant corruption. Also, it must be noted that credit availability or its price is probably not constant on the growth of corporate investment, given that large cash reserves of the non-financial corporate reported to be in the order of 700 billion or similar figure, And people are talking about this thing of huge capital reserves that exist. Of course, it's another issue about the certainty and all the issues related to that, which I'll come back to. But credit creation and extension at a reasonable price is absolutely critical to the creation of a black entrepreneurial stratum. The low level of SME finance, of course, we must note, may not necessarily represent a market failure. Sometimes we say that the fact that SMEs are receiving less finance is market failure. It's probably not. The price and quantum of SME credit may reflect its riskiness in the context of alternative choices of investment, because you're making choices about where to invest. This may be appropriate because of the dominant savings channel being contractional in nature. The pension funds you're using, and therefore they are risk averse by their very nature. But this is not to say that policymakers must accept this. In this regard, government could opt to subsidize losses and reduce the expected loss or riskiness. Government could incentivize SME credit by subsidizing this form of credit if it sees broader social benefits to doing so. Because there's consensus that you have to increase credit extension to small and medium enterprises. Low level of repayment of government-provided credit, and that's probably another element of this conversation. Because if you look at all government credit providers, their performance is disastrous. And that probably points to another problem, that government could do so. I mean, we could improve this by providing a system of technical assistance to incubate aspiring business owners. And the extent to which we're providing non-financial support to the SME sector could actually solve the problem in part. The other element that we could talk about is realizing that, and again, I'm saying, if you look at all government credit providers, whether it's CIFA, NEF, and provincial entities, all of them are underperforming. Delinquency rates are very high, etc., etc. Maybe it raises a question, whether should we use our public channels to actually extend credit to SMEs and industry? Or can we use the private sector and actually guarantee through guarantee schemes or whatever? South Africa has never embraced directed lending. Crude directed lending may have negative consequences. Brazil excesses show that crude directed lending can reinforce the existing economic structures. However, both South Korea and India have some form of directed lending within a market-based economy. And again, China has it too. Such directed lend credit can either be forced out of private sector with transparent, sensible regulations, or through DFIs, which are supported by both fiscal and monetary authorities. Again, weak governance arrangements often result this becoming a loans for friends. So a prerequisite, again, for any type of directed lending and subsidized credit scheme is a capable and accountable state. You can't escape that. That's probably the central point I'm making. And that condition, I would argue, remains necessary and indispensable. Coming back to a key hindrance of our financial system to radical economic transformation arises from our efforts to control price inflation in the context of a flexible exchange rate internationally, internationally mobile capital, and current account and fiscal deficits. Essentially, South Africa's interest rates are kept high to induce portfolio capital inflows that are necessary to prevent the rand depreciation and consequent price inflation. This now becomes even more important with the downgrade and closes the space further for any creative remedies. Also, it has been argued that volatility of currency has worked against a restructuring of the economy, since it biases the allocation of resources towards non-tradable, and with mining sector sometimes benefiting. In general, both manufacturing and services that could be exported underperform because of the currency big swings. These swings are too large and discourage investment in these sectors. While inflation targeting might be the least bad option, it has also its unintended consequences. So the question I would want to leave here today with real financial experts in the room, and I must confess I'm not, is how to better achieve price stability combined with lower interest rates and more competitive exchange rate. Or is it just wanting a cake and eating it too? Because that's probably a very big debate that we need to have. And as we deliberate on this, there are a number of other possible hindrances, to quote again Joel's question, related to the role of financial system in supporting radical economic transformation. The first relates to the phenomenon of financialization of the economy, which refers not only to increasing share of finance sector in GDP, but also the increasing role of the financial motives, financial markets, financial actors and institutions in the operations of domestic and international economies. As the IMF study titled Too Much Finance conclude, finance is no longer a progressive force of capitalism, as it was in the days of Marx, Schopenhauer, and Keynes. The primary concern is that the sector, with its high returns, attracts capital away from productive investments. I know it could also be argued that the high cost of doing business and risks in the productive economy are a disincentive to investment. But I do think we need a conversation in this area, and I'm just flagging it for conversation. Similarly, the financial sector, with its relatively high wages, attracts our best talent. So imagine the highly educated black business talent represented by, for example, APSIP. And imagine the boost to inclusive growth that would happen if you shift some of them to other sectors of the economy. Again, I'm not arguing, that finance sector must be blamed for the failure of our education and training system, because that remains a critical issue that we must address. A second hindrance to RT relates to how our financial system has increased asset prices over the last 20 years. Both financial and fixed property values. This benefited existing asset owners and was a countervailing force to inequality reduction through fiscal redistribution. It also now makes the acquisition of assets by new entrants more difficult. Of course, current calls for expropriation without compensations are unhelpful and will only serve to further starve the economy of the much-needed investment. And the point that and employment, by the way, which I'll come back to. We instead need a fresh conversations with our banks, relevant state agencies, DFIs, and existing asset owners about how we can collectively increase asset share amongst previously dispossessed. And as I have argued previously, we also need to focus on creating new assets and new wealth, in which Black South Africans have a greater share. This is something we have not been able to succeed in, actually, over the last couple of years, probably except for renewable energy. Thirdly, and related to the last point, I find it quite remarkable that the private equity and venture capital industry is so small, with funds invested only equal to about 5% of total bank credit extensions. Moreover, most private equity deals in South Africa have been around BEE rather than investment in innovative entrepreneurial startups and expansion. There are also very few black venture capital companies. So it is this frustrating stubbornness of the status quo that explains the urgent need for fundamental reshaping of our economy, which many people now believe must be led by a strong growth of investment in new black entrepreneurial class. A key component of any successful inclusive growth project must surely involve the emergence of a genuine black class of innovative and entrepreneurial business people, not just entrepreneurs and BE wheeler dealers. This is a new class formation process, and it will require the development of a rich network ecology. In other words, we need a new ecosystem to support the growth and development of this thing. That involves financial corporations, non-financial corporations, big business, DFIs, job fund windows, universities, science councils, etc., etc. We probably have most of the ingredients of this ecology. But I'm emphasizing networked ecology, that you do need to actually ensure better coordination of this. While the National Development Plan encourages entrepreneurship as well as research and development spending and commercialization, it does not, I think, say enough about the crucial role of venture capital finance. Also, while the draft amended Financial Services BBEE, I can't pronounce that, but whatever it's called, sector code has empowerment finance amongst its tick box scorecard, it only amounts to only 13% of the total scorecard and probably would get lost. In addition, the target for the banking sector under empowerment financing is very modest, amounting to extra 80 billion spread over 5 years. This is equal to just 3% of present bank credit extensions. So to build a new and a black entrepreneurial class, we need a new focused and energized approach that goes far beyond existing initiatives. The role of bank will be crucial in this, whether this participation can be engineered by bank regulation, fiscal intervention, talking about all three or any other form, but I think it's something that I would suggest that we need to look at. Now I want to deal with the circulation of, I'm done with circulation of private money, and let me move to fiscal authorities. I think I do. I've never spoken for so long. Thanks to Joel. Let me be briefer with the fiscal issues. I think they are simpler, better understood, and sometimes less controversial than those relating to money, banking, and finance. The politics of the fiscus, as I'm saying, they are probably less difficult than economics. And I know that people have fatigue on economics. The term fiscal authority would normally be taken to include National Treasury, SARS, provincial and municipal treasuries, numerous other specialized public finance entities. National Treasury is mandated by the Constitution to ensure transparency, accountability, and sound financial controls in management of public finance. Again, to save time, in the paper, I've got extensive notes on that. The important point probably that I think my little experience in Treasury over the years is that in order to perform that constitutional mandate, you need political support for treasuries. And I think if there's anything South Africa probably should learn that, and we're learning that very fast. If there's any crisis that we have had over the last couple of years, particularly the last 5 ones, is the growing decline in political support for treasury. In other words, supporting it to do what is a constitutional mandate for a host of reasons that probably you would know best. And I'm stressing this thing because I think if you are to make fiscal authorities effective in supporting a radical economic transformation, you've got to give them support to perform their constitutional responsibility. And that's probably the challenge that we have. And I'll break down the issue, starting with taxation, and coming again, answering the question, Joel, about what helps. Obviously, taxation is probably a critical element of what helps to promote inclusive growth. And what we collect in the country, and we probably have we had a very strong experience in revenue collection as a country. I think we've been very efficient. And what we collect is equivalent to 30% of our GDP. And if you think about it, it could really do very well to support growth and inclusive growth if well deployed. Moreover, we have a progressive tax system whereby richer people get taxed proportionally more than poorer people. And I know this is a difficult point. This contributes to the reduction of inequality, and it's important for reducing inequality in part, which is a critical aspect of inclusive growth, but it's also important for social solidarity. I mean, because think about it, I mean, whatever is collected in tax goes to health, education, security, and so on, and therefore creates better environment for people to survive. But taxation, in many ways, could be a hindrance to inclusive growth. If rates were too high, so as to stifle incentives to invest. So it's very important that in our approach to taxation, we must actually realize that it's also a double-edged sword if we don't manage it very well. But the other important thing is also about the importance of the integrity of our revenue collecting agency. Because I think the success that we've had as a country in this space of revenue has actually largely been as a result of the legitimacy of SARS. And if you tamper with that and destroy that, it has huge implications. You might even have tax revolts. But the second part is the spending part, obviously, which I come for, fiscal spending. In the current financial year, total spending from the National Revenue Fund is budgeted to be 1.5 trillion, and should I say 33% of GDP. And it's important that I say this upfront as I'm stating this thing, that obviously that shows that immediately that you have a deficit. I mean, you must raise money through other means, as it were. And 2/3 of the 2017 budget is allocated to functions dedicated to constitutionally mandated social rights, including healthcare, social security, and housing. Now, according to recent studies, and everybody seems to accept that, fiscal redistribution in South Africa has been very effective. Despite many critiques, of course. I mean, we kind of compare very well with Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Indonesia, etc. We have probably the most robust fiscal redistribution program. And it has been a great help in ensuring inclusive growth in a sense. But despite this major contribution effort, South Africa's inequality has not fallen. Why? Essentially, fiscal redistribution efforts were offset by several factors. I mean, the first is what I've spoken about, financialization. The second is continued very high unemployment rates due to the absence of employment-intensive industrialization, technological changes, and global competition. The other part is fiscal allocation, the composition of budget. You know, because I was trying to say that as it's good to have the volume of money we have, but the important thing is, where do we deploy it? Where is the focus of our deployment of resources? And if you look at our spending, we have actually been doing we have a highly consumptive budget. as opposed to investment in infrastructure, etc. Although it's good, but I don't think it's up to standard. But there is no doubt that our extensive fiscal redistribution effort have eradicated extreme poverty and provided access to basic services, and it helped to make our economy more inclusive, as I was saying. And part of the strength of our fiscal authorities is also the institutional capacity of Treasury and their professional control of fiscal spending is an essential condition for the future of inclusive growth in the country. And just to kind of highlight this point, National Treasury manages fiscal spending in an orderly and transparent way, and we have to do that, and in an orderly and transparent way. And that's why I think we have probably the most open budget as a country. We also try to manage budgeting in a more democratic way, as it were. And again, that's probably a strength for South Africa. But we must accept that there are a couple of issues. If you look at the controls, the regulations in place, PFMA, MFMA, etc., they probably give assurance in some sense that, and the Auditor General, etc., they give assurance that we'll have the public money well spent. I'm sure if I say having public money well spent, you say I'm living in another country. Because despite those strong regulations, it's very clear that as a country we must confront the issue of value for money and the issue of our allocation of expenditure. And coming to the budget fiscal deficit and debt, because that's probably just to end off this discussion quickly. The budget deficit for 2017-18 is sitting at 148 billion. That is, government is budgeted to be greater than it's to spend more money than the revenue coming in, and which is important, and it equals to about 3.4% of GDP. Government debt is about 2 trillion, or approaching 50% of GDP. And we could say more about the problems relating to this thing. So since 2009, the 2009 global recessions and limited economic recovery since then, we've engaged in what they call counter-cyclical fiscal policy. In other words, we continued to spend against the wind, basically. That's what it means. The low growth scenario has lasted much longer than anyone expected. We currently now find ourselves with higher government debt, higher debt service cost, higher dependency on foreigners for fiscal borrowing, and therefore more beholden, of course, we can't ignore now rating agencies. As some people think that it's a rand if it falls, and if they do this, it's a conspiracy or whatever it is. The reality is that we have no chance. We have a small, open economy as a country. And I'm not sure the gravity of this situation is sometimes understood by key players in the leadership positions. The result has been that the green shoots that were appearing as a result of rising commodity prices and demand, as well as the improvements in the emerging markets, have been momentarily destroyed by the downgrade. So, I mean, that's real. I mean, people don't, and I'm stressing this thing because I think as South Africans, we must begin to appreciate the importance of this situation we're in. So while our counter-cyclical policy was a help to the economy and allowed us to escape recession, our foreign debt and debt service costs are a significant hindrance to radical economic transformation. It is vital at this conjuncture that critical capabilities that exist within our fiscal authorities are retained. Now, because I think if you have a weak treasury at this point, when in fact you need to have tighter control, you're actually courting disaster. Our debt would become even more of a severe hindrance to RT if there was ever to be any debt monetization, whereby SAP was somehow directed to create money to pay its government debt. And this is a well-trodden route to hyperinflation as practiced by Weimar Germany, Zimbabwe, in the present, and Venezuela. Even a modest acceleration in inflation, in the inflation rate, presents a significant risk to fiscal sustainability, given that close to 35% of government debt is either inflation-linked or denominated in foreign currency. So our problems are real, in this regard. About a decade ago, the so-called Harvard panel recommended that South Africa should adopt tighter fiscal policy and looser monetary policy so as to achieve lower interest rates and weaker or more competitive exchange rate. The essence of this approach is to limit the extent to which domestic demand grows above sustainable rates of growth. When this occurs, the account deficit widens and inflation rises. But in the current circumstances, the room for such macroeconomic maneuver has been closed because of limited space for further fiscal consolidation. So my message again in summary. So the real scope, Joel responding to your question, for fiscal and monetary support for RET is less at macroeconomic demand management level, but rather at a level of microeconomic impact of taxation, public spending, and credit extension. So I think I know that there's over-obsession about macroeconomics. The reality of the matter is that there's probably very little space for maneuver at that level. Where we have space, I think, is looking at the microeconomic level, making our spending decision better, reducing also waste within our system. Just reflection on the politics of and dangers of economic populism, the politics of RET and the dangers of economic populism. I have written previously on the various competing narratives of radical economic transformation, and I don't want to repeat what I've said previously. And I would limit the few minutes left to focus on what I see as growing and extremely dangerous tendency that we need bold wisdom to overcome. Unfortunately, as we approach the December conference that everybody talks about, I know the people say there's no campaigning yet, whether that's real or not. But the reality, it's becoming ever more difficult to subject the radical economic transformation to what Amartya Sen calls democratic public reasoning. Policy positions are seen as proxies for factions, which themselves are cast as representatives of competing elites. No wonder we are losing credibility day by day. The involvement of global spin doctors such as Bell Pottinger has not helped. And as trust, both within the ruling party and among economic stakeholders declined, economic populism takes root. Populism works best in low-trust societies and encourages a range of ideologies left and right. In a real sense, it is more a way of doing than seeing, in which rationality is subordinated to expressiveness. The essence of populism is to define friends and enemies and demand that the state sides and behaves in a partisan manner, even if it breaks its own rules and bypasses the institutions established to uphold law. Populism denies complexity, it denies constraint, and it denies risk. It detracts attention from the real issues that must be addressed, and as evident in the current context, closes down space for democratic dialogue and conversation. It offers, as I quote Harrowell from his paper, the populist paper, 29 Years of Populism, and I quote, It gives absolute creative freedom to the bullshitter to come up with whatever audience would enjoy hearing. Hence its appeal to desperate politicians, and has massive traction, and it enjoys amongst sometimes the electorate. We probably need the wisdom and the courage to resist this fake news and dirty propaganda, especially that which divides us as South Africans. We need to recast, and that's probably the fundament. I agonized before when you said radical economic transformation. I agonized because the term has lost credibility. I agonized whether I should call it like that. So I would argue that we need to recast radical economic transformation as a genuine program of inclusive growth around which society can be mobilized, embedded in a consensual vision, and alert to the complexities, constraints, and opportunities of the current moment. That's the challenge that we have. In conclusion, I repeat what I say. Monetary and fiscal policies have been well designed and implemented to manage macroeconomic demand and price stability. In the short term, we need to politically protect and empower the fiscal and monetary authorities to continue to fulfill their constitutional mandate. But there may be scope to make fiscal and monetary policies more supportive of inclusive growth, not at a macro level, I stress, a macro demand management level, but for example, in terms of fiscal and credit allocation to support new black businesses, the development of new industries, expansion of empowerment-intensive export industries, logistics and infrastructure, etc. For this to happen, it is critical that these monetary and fiscal interventions are better coordinated within our overall development strategy, including our industrial policies, energy, skills, logistics, etc. A useful mechanism to achieve such integrations and coherence, not only within the state, but between the state and other economic stakeholders, will be a possibility of an economic charter. And I think we need to seriously consider, as a country, going into a new national dialogue that actually takes us to an economic charter. At a minimum, this charter must achieve sufficient consensus, commitments, and trade-offs around a few priorities for inclusive growth, including the following: building a capable, professional, and a corrupt-free state, increasing levels of employment and investment in fixed capital, increasing the black share of wealth and income, fixing the broken education and skills system. This democratic consensual vision must drive a workable agenda in a way that brings coherence to intergovernmental and societal cooperation. We must, as a matter of urgency, deal more decisively with vested interest in terms of uprooting corruption and taking steps to get more value for money from public spending. We must protect our institutions from corrupt interference and ensure that our state-owned companies, which should be the front line of our developmental state, are re-geared to serve national interest, not interest for the few. We must find the collective will to arrest the emergence of a shadow state in dressing up corruption as indigenization, and threatens not only the economy, but the fundamental principles of our constitutional democracy. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that very thought-provoking and I think quite sweeping overview of the issues, not just the focus on fiscal and monetary authorities and policies, but also more generally about the range of economic issues, as well as political economy issues that we're facing. So thank you very much, and another round of applause. I'm now going to hand over to Professor Erika Kramer-Mbula, who is a senior researcher with the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development. So she'll be asking the hard question about industrial development and how monetary and fiscal policy contribute towards industrial development. She's also associate professor at the University of Johannesburg. And she will take us through the question and answer session. We're going to be very disciplined with making sure that we stick to time and get you to the cocktail at the time allocated. But in the spirit of the conversation, that we may disagree, but we need to disagree in the interest of taking the debate forward. At the end of the day, this is the country that we have inherited. This is the country that we want our children to inherit, and we want to leave it a better place than what we have. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for an excellent lecture. Mr. Jonas, your presentation has been very rich, well grounded in the academic literature, in empirical evidence, and thought-provoking. You've posed a number of questions to the audience as well that you would like us to debate and deliberate together. So I would like to, without any further comments, open the floor for discussion and collective deliberation. There are only a couple of requests from your side. So I will request each one of you, if you have a question, please introduce yourself first, and second, please keep the comments short and sharp. And there will be one question or comment per person. So try and keep it like that, so the floor can have a good flow of interventions. We'll take about 3 or 4 questions at a time, and that will give you a chance to respond collectively to a group of questions. So any hands up? There's one here, one here. Let's take these 2 for now.
Thank you. My name is Mzwakembata from the Department of Trade and Industry. But I represent my views, not the department. There's a general confusion in the public discourse, Minister Jonas, so we can help us by unpacking the relationship or the distinction between the radical economic transformation and inclusive growth, which is which. I would have loved to further engage, but I will abide by the directive of the facilitator. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Mcebisi Jonas. I'm based here at UJ. Thank you for the seriousness with which you treated this question. I think there's a future here for you at UJ. I'm curious though. You are quite comprehensive, at the same time quite delicate. Delicate in assuming that these things could be resolved through dialogue. I'm wondering though, in trying to resolve the impasse, to what extent can we avoid a certain level of disruption? A friend who happens to work in Treasury today, or these days, suggested that we might have to entertain a certain level of discomfort, as it has happened in Venezuela elsewhere. And perhaps we might not have to go to Venezuela, we might point close by to Zimbabwe. But My main point, without being too elaborate, though, is really, can you resolve the impasse without confronting a certain degree of discomfort? Especially if you take, for instance, the little issue of land redistribution. Yes, dialogue is fine, but transformation by its very nature requires a certain degree of discomfort, perhaps. Is dialogue really realistic? I mean, it's perhaps a meaningless question, but worth posing nonetheless.
Great. One more question to add to this one? One more.
Hi, my name is Ranjini Mansami. I'm from the Daily Maverick. I wanted to find out, we're heading towards the ANC policy conference. I wanted to find out what, there are some NEC members here, so possibly they could assist. What policy changes to the current set of policies that the ANC has? What policy changes are required to realize radical economic transformation? Thank you.
Great. Okay, I think we'll take these three questions. They are all quite difficult questions. I'm sure you'll be able to unpack those. One is about the relationship between RET and inclusive growth. Another one is whether we can resolve it all by dialogue. You mentioned creative destruction at some point in your presentation. Perhaps there was a reminder that perhaps we need a disruption. I don't know if it's creative disruption or just disruption. And lately, what policy changes are required to achieve RET?
Look, I mean, again, I've tended to use more, if my preference matters, inclusive growth. Because if you think about it, the central problem we're facing in the immediate is the fact that we have high levels of exclusion in our economy, social and economic exclusion in South Africa. Obviously, in order to deal with that, there are certain fundamental interventions that need to be made in the economy. And part of it is they go beyond ownership. We need to answer, what are those forces that make the poor continue to be poor? I mean, part of it includes access to productive assets of different kind, that includes skills and other things, and take the debate far beyond the focus on asset grab. And I mean, we've got huge volume of experience and evidence that shows that asset grabs, by their very nature, don't grow any economy, nor address inequality in any significant way. And of course, we do need to increase access to assets, obviously, but how you do that is important. But the second aspect of it, I think, I always make a point that, Comrade Joel, that if there's any area where the ANC and government needs to show maturity of leadership, it is in how we deal with big capital and existing wealth in the country. Because in a sense, they are part of the problem and part of the solution, is effectively. So you need maturity on how you engage with it, as opposed to, populist statements, which I think are becoming increasingly fashionable within the ANC today. Did I say the ANC of today? Sorry, whatever it is. But I'm saying they are becoming too fashionable, as it were, in those things. The ANC historically, I think, its strength has always been ability to reflect on on realities, and the skill of getting into conversation, alliances with a whole range of stakeholders, and maneuvering them in one direction. And that's probably the skill that we've lost. And the challenge, I think, for the conversation within the ruling party, I will think that, how do we recoup that And also, let's face another challenge that the level of public confidence in the movement is also in decline. So it's a very delicate scenario, Mcebisi, that where you have like the ethical and moral credibility of leadership is not as strong. I'm trying to be as polite as I can. It's not as strong as it's supposed to be, and you at the same time ANC is not weak to a point where somebody can just push ANC aside. So you're bound to look at mechanisms of a more decent conversation about how to resolve some of the challenges we're facing. I mean, the fact that we had successful, no matter what your views are about minimum wage, but the fact that we managed to get some minimum wage shows that if there was more effort put and more understanding amongst our leadership that our economy is in a crisis, we cannot sustain the current levels of exclusion. And I tell you now, I mean, if you think that you can, we're actually going towards the wall, basically, or the cliff, whatever it is. So it might not be a matter of choice, because we are an electoral democracy, ultimately. And already the electorate has spoken in municipal election. That should be a serious indication. And if you go beyond December and you fail to take, coming back to Ranjani's question, I don't know. I know what I think should change. And I think I've tried to outline broadly some of those issues. But I think what needs to change is understanding that we need a more serious dialogue with society and get into a broad agreement where we get commitment from different sectors of society around the way forward on the economy. And then also people we have trade-offs from different sectors at the moment, and so on and so on. And without achieving that, we'll probably go the route of many countries, which I might not use as example. Hope I've answered the questions or escaped them successfully.
Okay, we have one question here, one question there, and one at the back.
Thank you very much for the outstanding lecture. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking very hard. There's a saying which says, an empty vessel makes the most noise. This issue of coming up with a lot of rhetoric, industrialists, creating industrialists, or we are going to have industrialists, it seems to me it's an empty vessel which makes a lot of noise. What causes this kind of situation?
Would you mind introducing?
I'm with MISTRA. I'm the chair of the Board of Governors.
Thanks for that very informative lecture. Mcebisi, what I want to know is, in the midst of all of this, there's lots what we call economic gluttony from the super rich. It seems there is no ceiling in terms of wealth and how much they need. YT Basson taking 400 million in terms of just as a bonus. Now, in the midst of this gluttony, my question to you is, because you didn't spend a lot of time on the role of the private sector. And I just think that I have this view that people like Cyril and Tokyo and many others in the early and mid-90s were simply given money because there was a need to create some form of semblance of a black bourgeoisie. And that, for obvious reasons, stopped at some point. And the private sector somehow now argues that we've all worked very hard for the money we have and the wealth we possess, and therefore you too need to do that. And I just think, with all the very real proposals and suggestions you've made, which I agree with, is, in your opinion, there any room to also say to the private sector that that kind of out-of-the-box thinking is required as well to move forward in terms of narrowing the gap? Thanks.
Did you introduce yourself?
Sorry, my name's Oscar van Heerden, and I'm with the Kgalema Motlanthe Foundation.
Right, thank you. There was one question there and one at the back. Yes. You can go first, since he has the microphone, then it will be you. So.
Okay. I'm Mike Miller. I'm a little reluctant to associate with Wits in this assembly, but that's my current association. I was interested in the way that we located this discussion talking about monetary and fiscal institutions. And I was wondering whether you think it might be more helpful to look at the economic institutions more broadly. I think we're all aware of the heroic defense of the ramparts by Treasury and the very great importance of political support for a Treasury. But if you isolate yourself as the one sort of captain on the ramparts defending to the last, it actually becomes quite an isolated position. And we were quite amused when the new economic cabinet was presented, where we had a DPE and an EDD and a DTI and a Treasury and a DPME and a National Planning Commission, which seemed to suggest that at least the function of allocation of the fiscal resources might be done slightly differently and slightly more collectively. I mean, I know we have a budget committee, but everyone blames Treasury anyway. But you didn't mention the rest of that economic constellation, and I'd be curious to know whether you think it could be better mobilized and be more sustainable as a consequence.
Right. Final question?
No, thanks. My name is Sami Mnengwan. I think before I ask the two questions I have, must start by thanking you, Comrade Mcebisi Jonas, for the role you played in exposing the toxic conduct of the corrupt Gupta family. I think we must thank you for that. And in my other life, I'm a BEC member of the ANC. I'm proud of you. You serve the people of this country very well. The questions I have, the first question will be with regard to the role of the PIC. Having served yourself as a chair there, don't you think that the PIC can play more role in terms of investing back to benefit the workers beyond building these malls, which when they go to the township, they are being dominated by the same players and they kill small businesses in the same time? So don't you think there is more role that the PIC can play? And number two, on the question of the Reserve Bank, I think thanks again for assisting with the information that we have, because in the past we have been subjected to the rhetoric that says nationalize the Reserve Bank, being made to believe that if you nationalize it, it's an end to itself. So I think one has learned a lot. But my question will be, if you say that those private shareholders are not a problem like it's been presented, why is it that we are failing to have a state-owned bank? Because the ruling party has resolved on this issue for close to 10 years now. Because the reality of the matter is that, as things stand, the four major big banks, maybe plus 1.5, they are not assisting when it comes to the development of small businesses. Even the way they fund the so-called the black middle class, when it comes to the purchase of cars and houses, is very problematic. They are exploiting us. So I want to check what is the problem with having a state-owned bank that will finance the development of small businesses and finance houses and cars at a reasonable rate. And lastly, my question is that, no, it's the last one, and it's very important. Lastly, Comrade Mcebisi Jonas, in your other role as a member of the ANC, I want to check, do you think the movement can still be rescued? I'm asking this question precisely because if you check in the current discourse, I mean, the politics are highly factionalized. You can't even discuss the policy without being labeled to be belonging to this faction or that other faction. Even some of the statements that have been made by some of the leaders, like you made an example, let the rand fall, we'll pick it up, welcome junk status, it won't affect our people. I mean,
Okay.
leaders, cabinet ministers. So the question is to say that the other issue that, in fact, some of the
please,
statements.
Please. I will please ask you to keep it short. Just go to the question.
Yeah, just the reason what makes me to ask this question, do you think it can be rescued? Because on some issues, you already know the views of certain leaders, even before they are discussed. So let me conclude it there before I
Thank you. Thanks so much for the questions. I'll pass them on to you, Mr. Jonas.
This thing of populism, Prof, I mean, I think it's becoming a global phenomenon. I think it's in times of economic difficulties and economic crisis, unemployment high, etc., and there is a sense in which people become disillusioned towards the establishment. Basically, I mean, it's so you have the Trump phenomena, the Brexit, and of course you've seen how elections have been going in Europe, etc. So it's rooted in the fact that when times are tough, I think populism tends to thrive. But I was also trying to add that also when the level of trust between the ruling elite, the political elites, and economic elites, and ordinary masses, when times are tough, it also becomes a problem. But in South Africa, we also have other levels of mistrust. I mean, the mistrust between big business and government and all sorts of things and so on. And if in those contexts you have weak leadership, and you have organizations also are weak to mobilize people and educate them, etc. Populism thrives in those environments, as it were. So my sense is that the normal response of ruling parties in those situations, it's either you take the extreme posture of populism and actually show the extremes that you can do, or right-wing, sometimes others take right-wing racial things. In fact, it's interesting that if you look at, I've actually been doing a simple exercise, and I've been looking at how many times the ANC leaders make racial insinuations. And just take the speeches and go through them. Forgive me, Comrade Joel. I didn't look at yours, Joel. But if you look at their speech, our speeches, increasingly there is almost they are increasingly being laced with racial undertones. For an organization which is rooted in non-racialism, that says a lot. And again, and I'm not denying the fact that we have challenges. We still have huge racial challenges, but I think the movement has always been able to articulate that without almost losing its non-racial character, and in the manner in which it is articulating it. So if you think about it, Africanism has actually become almost like a big element of public articulation by some of our leaders. And that's problematic. And it's also divisive in society. So populism is linked to the failure to find solutions to the complex problems we're facing. And the only way you could resolve to these things is by taking, hiding, escape into rhetoric and etc., instead of providing solutions to these problems. And that's, I think, the issue. And then I think, coming back to Ranjini's issue, for me, the biggest fear is that you enter into what you call policy conference, and actually you just have the same rhetoric and come up with nothing to solve and show no understanding of the urgency of our situation. And that's my biggest fear. I mean, so you instead of having a policy, you have a concert of noise. And that's the danger that we have, I mean, as it were. Oscar, I mean, you know, I haven't delved too much into the question, but I think the simple message I was trying to say is that I mean, if you push capital too hard, I mean, you have problems. if you don't push them, you don't, and towards transformation, you equally have a problem. So that's why I was saying that I think this single issue does require an attention. I think we had a process before I got fired, led by Minister Pravin, about talking to the top 100 CEOs in the country. And it was an interesting conversation because it started off by trying to show that we have a common destiny, we have a common challenge, and all of us need to work together to try to contribute towards that, and so on and so on. You do need to spend time in engaging them, as it were. I mean, in engaging big business, as it were. And the genetics of the African National Congress, I dare say that our base, if you look at social strata of South Africa, the voters come from, you know where they come from. And historically, our relationship with big business has always been antagonistic. So sometimes we kind of fall back to that easily, and some of the leaders fall back to that without realizing that we need to spend time and engage them and push them towards transforming, push them towards deracializing, contributing towards the deracialization of the economy. And that's doable, it can happen, if we put our minds to it and effort, as it were. And we're not doing it. Of course, I might say that we're not engaging anybody anyway. If you think about it, we seem that everybody must be saved. I mean, we don't have any priority, as it were, now, which is a problem. I didn't come clear when, Mark, on the beginning, when I was saying that the topic was, in a sense, confining in that sense of saying that monetary authorities and fiscal authorities are, in a sense, I mean, can do up to a particular level contribution. But you need whole of government and a whole range of other institutions to drive a radical economic transformation. And they have an important role to play in that space. And coming back, I want to link what you're saying with the state bank discussion. You know, the difficulty with our resolutions, I mean, sometimes is that we take a resolution. I don't know whether it's good or bad, don't ask me. But the question is that you can't manage ESCOM. You can't manage SAA. You can't manage your existing state-owned enterprises. In fact, your state-owned enterprises are increasingly becoming central to, if people read Tuli's report, Tuli Madonsela's report, they are almost so central to state capture and the development and evolution of shadow state, so to speak. How did Brian come back? I don't know. but I don't think it was taken in Tuli House. I doubt the decision. And many other evidences that are thrown around that show that increasingly you have a problem. So are you introducing another state institution called State Bank within that? I don't think that will be thoughtful. So I'm saying you take a resolution that is not linked with real world problem. The real world problem is that you must actually build a government that is less corrupt and try to, in a sense, destroy the symbiosis between constitutional state and shadow state, so that you kind of begin to create basis for looking at those other instruments that you can use. And that, I would argue that if you create a state bank in a context where what we have, I don't know, you probably will tell generations to come how we messed up the future of our country. But that's our resolution, so we must implement the resolution. But my view is that you can't blindly implement a resolution in a context where you can't even, even the smallest, by the way, of state-owned entity, you can't manage. You can't take decisive decision and appoint a proper CEO, a proper board. You know that the board is dysfunctional. I was in Treasury. It took us, 18 months to appoint a board of SAA. Not that we didn't know whom to appoint, but it shows you that if you do that, you're just deepening the crisis we're in. On the PIC, I agree with this thing, but I'm not as enthusiastic as you are on the, because again, we as a country we still have a strength because when people retire, they still have pension, and so on and so on. And you must go around the world. How you use pension funds to invest, etc., you have to do it very carefully. With really strict considerations. And I agree we must use it for infrastructure and other things. All what I'm saying is that just be careful that you don't create a scenario where when our pensioners go to retire, I mean, when people go workers retire, there's nothing. There are countries that have performed so badly in managing their pensions to an extent that pensions are paid from the current account. We don't have that as a country, but because remember that it is Fiscus that guarantees GPF ultimately. So in other words, the pension fund, public government pension fund is guaranteed by government. So if you take bad decisions and losses are huge and whatever, it comes back to Fiscus. It sinks Fiscus. So what you have is that whilst pension has been accumulated, you shift that whole pension into the current account and therefore increase your deficit and create further disaster. So I'm saying we do need to be cautious about how we approach that question. I know that sounds conservative.
Thanks. I will, if you don't mind, I'll take advantage as the facilitator, and I'll ask one question before I open the floor again. You emphasized in your presentation that the solution is at the micro-level interventions, and you also emphasized the importance of creating this black, large entrepreneurial base. Through some instruments such as credit, facilitating the access to credit, basically. I want to mention the fact that many entrepreneurs in South Africa, as well as in the rest of Africa, are informal. So you find many of them are running businesses. They are entrepreneurs, but they are not registered. How do you see? And again, there's a lot of discussion about the importance of integrating what is called here the first and the second economy. How do you see the informal economy playing a role in creating and building that entrepreneurial base that you emphasize as central for radical economic transformation or inclusive growth? So that would be my question. One more, one there, one here, lady. And one there, another lady. Thanks.
Thanks, Mcebisi. I'm David from Mapungubwe Institute. I'm here. It's interesting that you said I'm here. you just need to hear me. You don't have to see me. It's interesting that you said quite eloquently that we have to have macroeconomic stability, and I traced it back to the GIA years, that the same promise you are making now, or the same commitment you are making now, is the commitment that was made during the GIA years, that if you pay the apartheid debt, reduce deficit, ensure that government debt is contained and all of that, you will have, greater investment and all of that. But, that has happened, by and large, and the economic situation in the country remains the same. And I think the critic earlier on was quite correct on the input you made, that it actually, heavily was leaning more towards the public sector more than the private sector. And one of the issues that you raised in passing was fixed investment by the private sector, which is very low by global standards in the country. And that's one of the major problems. And of course, I mean, it's related to the question of trust between the state and business. It's also structural in the sense that there's been a shift into financialization, as you're saying. But I don't think that we can still, as Alice Amden puts it, that, you know, the prescription that says all that African states and post-colonial societies had to do was to focus on education, health, and leave the rest to everybody else, actually works. The greatest example of that is Zimbabwe, highly educated population, as well as Tunisia, highly educated with higher levels of even higher education access and so on. So those, you can do those, but the point is that you need to come back to whether there is shift and actual transformation in the economy itself. And if you don't have that, you are going to actually undo the progress you're making in the social sector. Thanks.
Great. There was one question there and another one there. Maybe you can go first, since you have the microphone, and then it will be you.
Okay. All right. I can go. Okay.
Please go ahead.
Good evening. I don't know if I should still call you my deputy minister or honorable, but I think it's befitting to say honorable, because I do think you deserve that status. And I think, more than anything, thank you for demystifying what radical economic transformation means. But mine is very simple. I just wanted to know that you make mention more than twice this evening about deracializing the ownership of the economy, that in your opinion is triple BEE still relevant in today's discourse?
Great. Thank you.
So I'm Catherine Kanamea. I used to be at MISTRA. Now I spread myself between community development and working in the Poverty and Inequality Initiative at UCT. And actually, David and I used to both be in political economy, and the irony is that I think the politics is a far greater constraint than the economics. But I have a very concrete question about how we build active citizenry within the society, because I've had the good fortune of going to pretty much every corner and being able to read audit reports that say a qualified audit report is not a reason for a celebration, and you're a community who lives next to one of the biggest dams in the country. And I can read that money was allocated to connect you to water, but there is no household water access, and there is no household electricity access. And I'm told that the chief says that the cars will go crazy, and some of the chiefs have nice cars. If we're going to travel across our society and take an active interest in developing it, even in sparse geographic spaces, what should I have done with that information? It meant that that reality within that locale would change, because the auditor knew about it, right? At some level, the Treasury knows about it. What do we do to change the circumstances of people who do not have representation, but matter very much for the political future of the society where they vote? And there isn't a better deal than the ANC at the moment.
Great. We'll take those 4 questions for now. Thanks. Okay, sure.
It's a bit of a follow-up on the question that was asked by the Prof about, because I'm wondering, you're talking about big business and SMME development, but isn't the problem, because the problem is not big business, the problem is the concentration and monopolies. And in fact, conglomerates in South African context where people have along the value chain. And therefore it makes, so it's not just only a problem of skills, a problem of access to assets or to capital, but it's also a question that you have sectors from construction to retail to you name it, where you have such concentration that the possibilities for new entrants to come into the space is very limited. And I'm sure from your experience in finance, it was the same issue. If you look at procurement, often we're talking about capture, but often it's fighting about 10% of contracts, and the rest, 90%, go to your established big business. So I think for me the question is, and I was quite surprised that it wasn't mentioned in your list of things that needs to be done, is the question about how do you deal with monopolies and monopolistic behavior that's fairly pervasive across every single sector of society, and in fact is a binding constraint towards new entry into the market.
Centrally, I think, I guess the point, I mean, I cover it quite interestingly, the issues around how and around what do you engage big business and holders of wealth in the country. Because it's important that we engage them, we push them towards dealing with some of these issues at one level. At another level, I think I've, throughout the paper, raised the issue of concentration in the economy as a critical issue, and the need to deal with that. In one part, you deal with it through competition commission or competition laws, and which are tightening again in the current reformulation of that. But part of it is also pushing big business towards trade-offs. I think, because I think I hear what you're saying, David, but the reality of the matter, I think we haven't had hard conversation with big business in this country. So it's not for that matter. I always argue that if we could have implemented GEAR to the full, we probably would not be here. Because seriously speaking, there's been pretty much consistency in macroeconomic policy up to now. But where I think the wheels have been falling off is at a macro level. I mean, I would argue. I mean, we have not, I mean, think about it, if you take DTI or you take any other department, the extent to which we have used incentives to effectively drive industrialization, et cetera, I mean, we have, I mean, if you look at DTI, it's what it was when Alec was there. I mean, with a few changes, some chair changes. And the global economy and national economy has been changing. So we must pay particular attention to detail, which we are not at the moment. If you think about it, you consolidate the amount of money we're putting into the SMME sector over the years, it runs into billions. For what? The outcomes are appalling. And so it's like almost like we operate like a train. If we take a particular direction, whether motivated by ideological, whatever, or policy direction, and we don't pause and say, what is the impact of what we're doing? So for me, I think we can take a route of ideologizing it, but I think I'm being pragmatic about it. I'm just saying that at a macro level, we have been appalling. It's only probably in the auto sector where we've done well in terms of the incentive that we have. But again, it's interesting because the auto sector success is also in part because at least that's one sector that probably has been better organized, but also that's one sector that government has engaged thoroughly. I think, I mean, that's one area where DTI skills are very interesting, good, and as it were. So I'm just saying that part of probably the simple message I'm passing is that we must look at the detail of what we're doing. Where are we putting resources as government? What is the impact of the resources we're putting in the areas where we're putting resources? And if we can, for 1 minute, 1 year, 1 month, put resources in the right places. I mean, take the infrastructure program as a case in point. I mean, quite frankly, it has not declined. It has been growing over the years. But look at the impact of our infrastructure build program. Of all the things that we say, it doesn't have the impact. And why does it, why? And again, you have a host of issues, capacity of government, the capacity of the state, and issues of corruption, and a whole range of other issues, as it were. So my point is that, yes, tampering with macroeconomic policy is a dangerous thing to do at this conjuncture. And I think the space to maneuver is very small. But I think we have huge opportunity in reshaping, I think, at a microeconomic level. We can have the debate then about gear and other things that you mentioned, David. I spoke about creating an ecosystem to support small and medium enterprises, and I think it includes the formal sector. But I think there's a sense in which we need to understand informality better, and I always think that we don't. And we probably need a different intervention to support informality far better than what we do. I always tell a story that I was driving in one where I come from. By the way, I got fired even there. But I was driving in some in some village, and there's a guy who's busy fixing tires on the road. So I said to this guy, I stopped, I said, if you want help from government, what kind of help can you get? So this guy looked at me and he said, why would I want help from government? So I said, do you want a loan? Do you want what? He said, no, I don't want that. And I think 10 years down the line, I went to a funeral in the same area recently. This guy has built a house around this place. And I stopped and spoke to him again. He has built a house around this place, and he works with his son now. Still fixing tires in the same place. He has a small machine now to fix the tire and so on. So I asked him, who gave you the money? He said, no, nobody gave me the money, and I don't want anybody's money. Because once of course, his issue was that if he gets borrowed money, he's going to have to pay it, but he has to pay tax also. That was his issue anyway. But I'm just saying that understand that sometimes our approach to informality is that the informal sector wants to migrate into the formal sector. It's not always the case. Let's just keep that in mind, that we must just create an environment within which it works, it can work better, it can thrive, it has the right skills, etc., and support it in that sense. But don't have this notion that every informal entrepreneur, whatever you call that, would aspire to be in the next stage, because it's not normally, obviously the case. And sometimes you kill the informal sector by trying to push it to migrate to the formality. So there's a need to, and then in government, let's face it, we don't understand informality. I think the researchers, should have a different methodology to understand informality. And the best methodology is, actively sitting with them, spending time with them, understand their logic, etc., and you'll understand it better, and you'll know what intervention needs to be made around that. What else did I not answer? Or active citizenry, Catherine, is it? Yeah. Look, it's interesting what's happening already in the country. You can see. I watch these marches. That pull thousands and thousands of people, whatever they are demanding, and so on and so on. But there's a very huge history and a huge base for mass mobilization and building a more active citizenry. And maybe we need to do more, spend more time, those who are involved in research and the NGOs and so on, to increase and sharpen consciousness around the issues around which people actually, the issues that people are taking up, as it were. Because sometimes, we get lost in the maze. Because, think about it, I was talking to somebody yesterday. I was trying to say to him, hey, state capture is a problem. That's my uncle. I was convincing him about state capture. So he looks at me. He said, I still get my salary every month. What are you talking about? Things are normal. So I think there's a sense in which we need to educate our communities and spend more time to understand the political moment and the economic moment. What is the political moment? What are the dynamics underlying the political moment, and how to exploit it? To actually begin and deepen democracy, but also ensure that there's growth and development happening in the country. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much. We are reaching the end of the question and answer section. There is one burning question that I will take, and I would please ask you to be very, very short.
Yes, it's very short. Nompumelelo Lorunji from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, South Africa. I just want to go back to the point about a dialogue, the dialogue, and you're not the first person to, call for dialogue. In the recent past, we've heard former presidents calling for a dialogue. We've heard the opposition leader of the UDM, Bantu Olumisa, also calling for a national dialogue. And I've just thought you could perhaps reflect on the role or the value or the place of the Constitution in terms of its vision. Is it deficient in its vision for cohesive and socially and economically inclusive society, that it can't galvanize society at this moment? And I'm just interested to know, because there's so much debate around the Constitution as well, around whether some sections need to be scrapped, whether it's still relevant for this time, etc. Where does it fit in this debate around radical economic transformation, and what do we do with it?
Look, I mean, that could be part of the conversation, but I don't share the view that our Constitution is deficient. In all the areas that people, whether it's land distribution, redistribution, or whatever, I don't share the view. I think I think the only problem sometimes that I feel with our Constitution is can I just be careful now? I'm not to lose any job anyway. So I think the only problem sometimes I feel we probably as a country need to think carefully about, and I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I think my lawyer friend drew my attention to the fact that it's about 28 very critical instances in our Constitution where in every direct way responsibility is left with one person, authority is left with one person. Now, maybe, I mean, when those who drafted, when we drafted the Constitution and debated it, we had a view that it will always be Mandela. and so you would not, for instance, if you take an example, you would not think that it's possible that the head of state is conflicted. For instance, I mean, you would not envisage that in that sense, or in any other things that you could say. And I do think that as South Africans, that's the only thing I have. I think we probably need to think carefully about that issue. I mean, that because I think if that is true, maybe lawyers should say, then you have a probably serious problem potentially, because if all other instruments fail, you're remaining with a constitution that continue to give one person authority to take decisions that probably could even disadvantage him or her. That's for me a big issue. I mean, and maybe we should go back and read it. I mean, but he said 28 instances. I mean, that are very big issues, and we give it to one person. And maybe Mandela would have understood that, on this one I can't take decision. Let me have a kind of somebody else. Let me delegate or something. I don't know. But not all of us are Mandela. That's probably the biggest lesson that we have. But I think our constitution is sufficient enough. It remains a very powerful document. And I think if we stick to some of the things that it says, we will achieve a lot. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So, thank you very much, everybody, for your great questions and comments, and thank you so much, Mr. Jonas, for your detailed engagement with each and every one of the questions we've shared, and we've learned a lot. You mentioned in your speech that radical economic transformation is progressive change. So it needs to be an ongoing conversation. And I think this debate is a step into that direction. So thank you very much. I would like to ask for another round of applause for Mr. Jonas.
Okay, a round of applause to our very able facilitator. Professor Erika Kramer-Mbula, and thank you very much once again to all of you for those questions. We're going to have the closing remarks by the Executive Director of Mapungubwe, Joel Netshitenze, who will thank you all and make some concluding remarks before we end.
Program Director, thank you very much. Although I'm tempted to enter the discussion, my job is merely to thank everyone for participating in this annual Mapungubwe lecture. I think it would be an understatement to say that I think it would be an understatement to say that the period between the invitation and this lecture has been characterized by momentous events. When we first contacted him, Mr. Mcebisi Jonas was a Deputy Minister of Finance, and that was before he was recalled from London, but he was in South Africa. And so we had to scramble to insert a former deputy minister in the invitation notices. And so we should thank you profoundly for still coming in spite of a change in circumstance. And I think your tour de force today demonstrates that knowledge and capacity for strategic reflection have nothing to do with the rarefied status of political office. In fact, these days in our country and further afield, the inverse seems to be the case. So thank you for your profound contribution to the debate on, should I call it inclusive growth or radical economic transformation? How it relates to the very concept of revolutionary change, but also how it can lend itself to opportunistic appropriation. And I think all of us would agree with what you said, that fiscal and monetary authorities have got an important role to play in the restructuring of the economy, income distribution, and so on and so forth. And therefore, sensible macroeconomic policies and radical economic transformation should not be mutually exclusive. But I think what this discussion today demonstrated is that there are no easy answers to these questions, and the discussion should continue using whatever platforms are available. I suppose I should also thank Ms. Phoebe Potgieter-Gubule and Professor Erika Kramer-Mbula for facilitating the discussion. Also, thank you, the audience, for joining us and lending such a gusto to the discourse. For many years, Yellowwoods, through Spire Wine Estate, has supported the Mapungubwe lecture with their choicest of wines, to the extent that we have come to take this for granted. So we would want to say to them, Nangomso. And we also wish to thank our partner, the University of Johannesburg, as well as the teams from both MISTRA and the UJ, which organized the event. So thank you all. And perhaps to Mcebisi Jonas, we need to reiterate the obvious. There are instances when purgatory can be a blessing. And we'll continue to revere you more than ever before as our leader in the cause of social transformation. There are refreshments downstairs. Thank you to everyone.